We on? Okay. If y'all don't know me, my name's Jeff Mayfield. I think most everybody does. Anybody that knows me knows I do not like public speaking. Okay, let's get that clear first. The other thing is Danny Westbrook asked me to find a spot and stand so he could record this. I can't stand still and talk. I can't look at you while I'm talking because if anybody makes a facial expression, I'll get cracked up or anything like that. But we are going to talk a little bit about the medical aspects of crucifixion. To be clear, I'm not a theologian. I told Brother Owen, if I make any theological mistakes, he can correct me on the spot. That's perfectly fine. Philip can as well. Also, a lot of this talk is something that's very personal to me, okay? This is somebody that I care deeply about, and it is very difficult to talk about it when you know the anatomy and you know what exactly happened, or else you have a pretty good idea what happened. It does have a tendency to hurt. So if I get to the point where it seems like I'm blank and non-emotional, that's just a mode I have to go through to get through it. So anyway, we'll get started with it. If y'all could do the first slide. Okay, medical aspects of crucifixion. I can't see that back slide very well, guys. I don't know if y'all can turn the lights down back there or what. So I think it's this one in my face that's the biggest problem. I'll just look up here. We're going to discuss the medical conditions Jesus experienced prior to crucifixion. Okay, we're going to discuss the process and method of crucifixion from a medical standpoint. And I really want to expose the suffering that Jesus experienced while he was going through this process. Next slide. Okay, the information that I'm giving you is factual. Okay? What I think happens, the medical diagnosis, conditions, those are my opinions. No one knows this information for sure. Exactly what happened, exactly how it happened. We know when, we know why, but we don't have all the details. So just remember that as we're talking. Okay, content is graphic. I will try to keep it toned down. I'm not going to talk in-depth medical, but we are going to talk some medical. But if that bothers anyone and you have to leave, it's not going to bother me if you do, okay? So just kind of be aware of that. I don't think there's any young kids in here. I don't think this would be appropriate for them to be in with. But anyway, go ahead. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about shock because this is important for what happens at the crucifixion, okay? Shock is a situation, and the definition's up there, but what that means is there's a derangement in our body's circulation, how the blood flows through, to the point where you lose perfusion or liquid to your tissues, to your organs and things like that. It can happen due to a variety of conditions, but in our situation, we're going to talk a little bit about loss of volume. Okay, in other words, blood loss, because that contributes greatly to the entire conversation. That's a term known as hypovolemic shock. Okay, you've got insufficient blood flow to supply the organs in your bodies, whether they be kidneys, whether they be liver, whether it be gastrointestinal tract, muscle, whatever. When you impair that, it causes a set of reactions to occur that leads to death. Y'all have all heard the term, they bled out. They're bleeding out. They're going through kidney failure. They're whatever, we're losing them because we have multi-organ failure. That typically is hypovolemic shock, at least for our conversation tonight. Next slide. Okay, shock, severe circulatory failure, we're not getting enough blood to the tissue, marked reduction in blood flow to our vital organs, okay, including the brain. It results in cell damage and cells dying, okay, whether it be brain cells, whether it be muscle cells, whatever. Anybody who has gone through a heat stroke before and has recovered from it knows the pain in the muscle after not getting good blood supply to that. I don't know if anybody's been through that or not, but it's a terrible, terrible situation. That's what we're talking about, cells dying, cells being damaged. Next slide, please. With shock, we have a series of things that happens. Blood pressure drops low. Now, I don't know what medicines everybody in the audience is on, but if you've ever gotten in a situation where your blood pressure gets low, okay, you're going to have trouble concentrating, you're going to get lightheaded, you're going to get dizzy. Heart rate will typically go up in shock, and we're not talking about going up from 70 to 90, we're talking about going from 70 to 130, 140. Enough so that you can physically typically see the the heart beating in the chest, depending on the size of the person. Increased respiratory rate, remember that one, okay, because that's going to be pertinent to when he is actually hanging on the cross. Pulmonary edema, that's where fluid collects on the lungs. Okay, anybody in the room that's been through an episode of congestive heart failure knows exactly what that's like. It's like drowning, literally. Electrolyte abnormalities, think about more like a potassium or something like that where you have cramps when they get low. A lot of the other electrolytes get out of whack, but let's just go with that for now. And the skin becomes kind of cool and pale, okay? If you think about the times that this was all occurring, that can make a difference in how he felt at the time. Okay, next slide, please. All right, questions quickly. I went through that because we got a lot to cover. Any questions on shock or what's going on with those conditions? And we'll get into the meat of the talk. Anybody? Man, I did that good of a job? I don't think so. All right, next question, or next slide. Luke 22:44. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Okay? It's kind of fascinating that that could happen, isn't it? It's a very rare condition, if y'all can go to the next slide, okay, called hematidrosis or hematohidrosis. Very, very rare, okay, which a human being actually sweats blood. Go to the next slide. This slide right here shows a picture kind of the skin and how it looks. Now the top layers that are kind of curvy, that's the epidermis. There are 5 layers of that, okay? The bottom 2 are when you get into live skin. Underneath that, you have the dermis, which has the hair follicles, the sweat glands, the oil glands, but it also has loops of capillaries in it. Capillaries are little bitty small blood vessels that supply tissue, okay? So what happens in this condition, the capillaries around the sweat glands, which you can see in the middle right-hand corner, okay, become fragile and they start leaking blood. When that happens, it becomes kind of mingled with the sweat itself, and a person perspires these great drops of blood. Okay, it's sweat and blood mixed. Next slide, please. From my original presentation, I've not looked at any data from the 21st century, but in the 20th century, there were 76 cases that were studied. Okay, typically occurred in episodes of very high emotional states, fear, intense mental contemplation. If Jesus knew what he was going to go through, how could he not be somewhat afraid as a human being? Even though he knew, okay? And I can't imagine the anguish that he was going through at that time. If you also remember, this was occurring sometime around midnight. Okay? So if he's having this condition, he's sweating like that, I would bet the weather was cool. I would say it was an uncomfortable prayer, okay, that he went through. I can understand better why he was so frustrated that the apostles couldn't stay awake. Okay? I mean, he's going through a lot emotionally at this point in time and a lot of mental anguish. Next slide if we could. What this condition, hematidrosis, can cause, it can cause your blood volume to drop down, but that's very rare. It's hard to sweat out that much blood, okay? But it will cause the skin to become very sensitive. If you're bleeding up underneath the skin, it's going to be a little bit more touchy. Okay, we all know what's going to happen as we get further in the talk, so you can imagine that plays into it. And in the cool of the night, it probably caused him to have chills. I just want to present to you that this prayer, I always had this image that he's comfortable and he's praying and everything. He was very uncomfortable. This was a very hard thing for him to go through. Okay, and I don't ever think about it that way when I read it, but kind of puts it in light. Next slide. Okay. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him in the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy." Now he's been betrayed, okay, and I mean, I've been betrayed by friends before, and it's not a great thing to go through, okay. I've never been arrested, at least as far as y'all know I have. I don't think I have anyway, but I've never been arrested. I've never been convicted, I guess. No, I've never been arrested, but he's gone through a whole lot at this point in time, and we're to the point where he's going to go through the first beating of the night. This is somewhere between 1 and 3 in the morning. Philip, right on that? Correct? 1 and 3 in the morning. Next slide if we could. So, to beat him in this verse literally means to hit with a clenched fist. Okay? Sink in, guys. To hit with a clenched fist. They've got him in this position. He's probably bound. I don't know that. I'm guessing he probably was. They beat him in the face. That's what it says, okay? My guess, knowing the violence and the cruelty of what I've read about, he may have been beaten beyond recognition at this point, okay? Go to the next slide if we could. The trauma, I mean, odds are his eyes were swollen, maybe swollen shut. You don't know. Nose bleeding, lips busted, swollen, probably multiple lacerations. I mean, I don't know that, but I suspect. Scalp hematomas, those are just bruises, punk knots, whatever you want to call them. I mean, who knows what all he had, but they were literally taking their fist and beating him, okay? Skin was already very sensitive in this area like we talked about before, okay? I mean, we have some bleeding. We know that it was there. We know that it's the middle of the night. We know he's tired. I mean, there's a lot going on. Next slide if we could. All right, between 8 and 9, trial before Pilate. That's a little late, isn't it, Philip? It's closer to 6? Somewhere in there? Okay. And when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Okay. Next slide if we could. Scourging and crucifixion. Romans didn't invent crucifixion, okay? They perfected it. It was a high art form to them, okay? And they took great pleasure in using this as a form of torture and capital punishment. Their goal was to produce a slow death with maximal pain and suffering. This is a speculation, totally mine. I can see these guys betting on how long can we keep him alive and how much can we do. Okay, we're talking about a level of cruelty, and just my opinion, it is a true testament to how bad Satan hates human beings. So much so that he laid on the hearts of these men to do this to someone who's really not ever done anything to them. Okay? So, I mean, to me, I don't know. I just see a cruelty here that I can't imagine. Next slide. Okay, this scourging, this beating was preliminary to every Roman execution according to what I read. Okay? That may be incorrect. Purpose was to weaken the victim through blood loss, which we've already lost some, and hypovolemic shock. Now, they didn't have that kind of medical knowledge at that time, but that was their goal. They knew that if they weakened this person, they wouldn't have to stand there and watch him as long, and they'd get to go home early. I mean, I like it when my last patient doesn't show up sometimes because I get to go home in time for dinner, okay? I mean, these guys, this was a job to them. This was nothing. I mean, that's just what they did. The instrument they used was a short whip or flagellum. Next slide. Now, I'm not going to get into the last time I gave this talk, I got a lot of questions on how many times he actually got whipped, how many times he got hit, how many lashes. That part of it, I don't know. I'll defer to the Bible scholars in the room. I'm going to stay away from that one. But this consisted, if they used the typical method, of 3 separate thongs, long straps of probably leather, okay, ending in a set of 2 lead balls, pieces of bone, or both, okay? The kind of roughly shaped balls, these weren't like our ball bearings we see now. Their roughly shaped balls were actually designed where they would hit, inflict pain, and tear flesh. Bone the same way, okay? These things were long enough that they would hit the skin, catch hold, and when they came loose, they were tearing flesh when they came across. Okay, that's what they were designed to do. Had a wooden handle on it about 8 inches long. The thongs were, a foot long if you look at it. So they could get a lot of torque on those things. They were short enough and the handle was short enough that they could put some impact behind them. Okay. The multiple length of the thongs were designed to prevent the balls from striking each other. Okay, so they may have one staggered a little bit so it can get as much damage as possible. If it doesn't hit all at the same time, if they hit each other, that decreases the impact. Okay, overall length of this flagellum, which I spelled that wrong, was probably about 20 inches to 24 inches by the time everything was put into it. Okay, I'm quite sure they didn't get the weakest soldier to swing this thing either. Okay, I can't imagine that they would. Next slide. Okay, now on this slide, this is just a representation of how it's presented in the literature that I looked at. The victim was typically hanging, hands tied, okay? Knees were bent, okay? I mean, I don't think they wanted them trying to run away from the whip, so I think they had them in that position, okay? The blows would have been received to the back. I can't imagine they had enough control not to go around into the front part of the chest, the front part of the legs. I don't know whether it was a backhanded or a forehanded or both. All I can tell you is by description, they came down at a 45-degree angle so that he got the maximum drag they could get with every strike. Okay, that was as much as they could get. Straight up and down, they couldn't get as much tissue damage. Across kind of goes along with what they look like. You have bleeding from the skin at this point, but a totally different type than what we had before. But please remember, his skin's already a little sensitive. He's probably cold. I mean, and I don't know how y'all are, but if you got a cold ear and somebody reaches up and touches, it hurts. I mean, the weather may have had some factor in that. That part I don't know, just speculation. But again, you can kind of see the pattern of how they struck on these as far as they came across. Next slide. The initial blows would open the skin, the top layers of the epidermis, down into the subcutaneous tissue. Okay? We've already talked about that. That's where you start getting into blood supply. Okay, that's when you start bleeding. If you're trying to dig a splinter out, there's a point where you can't go any further in there. It starts to hurt at that point. But when they get into that deeper tissue, it's going to go through that, and it actually goes below the dermis into the subcutaneous fat in the muscle when they're doing this. But this is a process. It's not like the first lick did that. It was probably several that got down in deeper and deeper mocha every time. Okay, next slide if we could. This is just a demonstration, and I'm kind of going through this just to give you a picture of musculature. Let's make some assumptions here. Jesus probably did manual labor. Carpenter's kid, right? He probably was in pretty good condition. I don't think that he jumped in his Chevrolet pickup truck and drove from point A to point B. He walked everywhere. Okay? My guess is Jesus was probably in very good condition, very good shape. Okay? I don't have as much muscle as a lot of people that are younger than me and some that are older. But anyway, these muscles are layered on top of each other. Okay? You've got superficial muscles that you can see, but you also have deep muscles. Some of these muscles were probably on the surface about that thick, a couple inches, maybe more. I don't know what his build was. Okay? But again, to tear through that amount of flesh with the scourging, I mean, it took some effort to get there. So the superficial muscles of the chest that were torn, there's a lot of them there. Some of them you heard before. Next slide. But the deep muscles are when you get into the area, especially on the back. Now, I can't see his abdominal muscles torn in the front. I can see them torn in the back. Go to the next slide if we could. Okay, but the superficial muscles of the back, those are the things that we see on our bodybuilders. When we see them, they flex those out. I can't do that because it doesn't show up anyway. But anyway, these deep muscles are very thick in the back. Most people that work very hard for a living, their back muscles are, they're big. They're thick. So if you go to the next slide, you get into the deeper muscles down there, which are a little bit smaller, and they're not as thick. They don't have as much force on them. They still have a lot of force, but they're typically smaller than some of the big back muscles. After you get beneath those, you get into the three layers of what's called the intercostal muscles. Those are the muscles that run between the ribs. Okay? Those muscles typically run in three directions, and we'll talk a little bit more about what they do. But my guess is, next slide if we could, my guess is that when they were doing this, they were tearing into the deeper muscles, maybe even deeper than that. Okay? That's speculation on my part. Okay, we'll get into that more later. One other thing is, I don't know if we have a lot of deer hunters in the room. I assume we do. Philip, what's your favorite part of the deer meat? Backstrap muscles. Backstrap muscles are a ridge of muscles across the back. They run right next to the spine. Okay? They're basically a big tent or a big barrier over a set of nerves that exit out of the spinal cord called the dorsal root ganglia. Now, these are directly connected to the spinal cord. When somebody checks your reflexes, it goes through the dorsal root ganglia. I mean, it's just a big hub for the electrical currents in that area. If, and I suspect they did, if they were able to tear through the backstrap muscles, they're tearing into nerves. I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer or not, but does anybody in the room have neuropathy or nerve pain or anything like that they want to talk about? How does it feel? What does it feel like?
Burning, itching, numbness, I have it all.
It's just uncomfortable,
It's terrible.
okay? Now, imagine that times 100, okay? It's this horrible, and I can't describe it adequately, this horrible electrical current, okay? Almost like you're being electrocuted with every hit. So it's not enough that we've already torn all this tissue up. It's enough that we're tearing into whatever underneath it. Now we're starting to tear into nerves, causing even more pain. Again, guys, they perfected this method of torture, okay? But anyway, next slide if we could. Okay. What about internal organ damage at this point with the scourging? I don't think there is any. Okay? I don't think there is any. It's possible, speculation totally, that internal organs and bones may have been visible. I don't think they held anything back on this situation. I think that they were there to prove whatever point they were trying to prove. Do I think the lungs were exposed? No, I don't. Okay, I don't think that we got that far down because there's too thick of muscles to get through and tear through at that point. But to say that you couldn't see the lower edge of the ribs, to say that you couldn't see a kidney, that you couldn't see something like that, at least a portion of it, I mean, I don't see why that wouldn't be possible in this situation. Next slide. Okay. The appearance of the body when they got through would be like shredded meat. From what I have read, not in the account of Jesus, but in the account of other ones, it almost looks like strips of meat hanging down. Okay, that and skin. Okay? I can't stress to you enough the amount of bleeding that would occur in this situation. We talked about hypovolemic shock before. He's got to be there. Okay? He's got to be there at this point in time. He's got to be losing enough blood that it's starting to make a difference. Okay? I mean, most of us, we lose a little bit of blood and we feel like we're going to die. I mean, we're talking about massive amounts of bleeding at this point in time. Okay? I can't read the last slide, guys. I'm sorry. Most of the time, and this is just thinking how the human body works, I think that if they were doing to him what I speculate they were doing, I would bet he kind of came in and out of consciousness. We've seen that happen on movies before and things like that. I've never seen a reenactment of, Christ being scourged. I know there's a movie out there with it. I've never seen it, but I can't imagine he could maintain consciousness at this level. If he did, great. I don't know, but I can't see how he wouldn't be coming in and out. Any of us would, even the strongest among us. Next slide, if we could. Let's look at an eyewitness account, okay? And this kind of sums it up, and hang with me on this one. Peter said, "By whose stripes ye were healed." Okay? We've all heard that 1,000 times. If you break this down, and this is where my Bible scholars can correct me, okay? Stripes in this context implies singularity, okay? One wound. Two theories on that, okay? One is that with one blow, this occurred. In other words, with one, how do I need to describe that, Philip? One blow and the world was saved, or they killed him with one blow. How was the interpretation from, or Brother John, either one? My theory on this is that his entire back, whether it be the back of his legs, whether it be his back muscles, whatever, looked like one gigantic wound. Okay, I don't think you could tell there was a cut here and a cut here and a cut here like the diagram we saw a minute ago. I think his back looked like one macerated piece of shredded meat that was literally bloody and dripping with blood, okay? One wound. I've never seen anything like that. I've seen some horrific stuff in my life, in my career, stuff that I don't even want to talk about. But I've never seen anything where an entire back looked like one wound. I've seen part of it damaged, but I've never seen it where it's one like that, okay? Imagine that. Put that in perspective. Think about what's about to happen to him, okay? And the state of his skin, musculature, underlying organs, okay? So again, it's just horrific to even think about. I can't even put it into words adequately, and I'm sorry I can't, but one massive wound. Next slide. Okay, what did Jesus look like at this point? Well, we really don't know for sure. Okay, I'm using a lot of supposition. I know he had facial and head trauma he had to have. They've been beating him in the face. Chest, back, arms, buttocks, lacerations, full thickness. Full thickness typically means all the way through to the bone, and a lot of the implications are that these were full thickness wounds and when you read it. Okay, I suspect that if you knew Jesus, you would not have recognized him. Okay, don't know that, but I would bet you wouldn't know who he was. Okay, next slide. Questions on scourging. I'm glad we're through that part because I hate that part. Nobody? Nothing? Leroy, no questions? Nothing?
How long would this have lasted?
How long would it have lasted? I don't know that one. It comes down to how many lashes they gave him. I suspect it wasn't terribly long. You know, I mean, what is the number? Is it 39 that I hear? Is that correct? Huh?
39 according to Jewish law, but these are Romans.
Yeah.
I had a question as far as, you know, the ribs are not very far under the skin.
No.
I could see that ribs.
Right. Very much so. Very much so. And that's where the intercostal muscles come in. They form a web between the ribs, which is why I don't think they collapsed lung or anything doing this. That's a good question, but yeah, very much correct. Scarlett, you got a question? Oh, okay. Anybody else have any questions? Deb, you look like you got a question.
Not yet.
Not yet? Yes, ma'am.
Hematihydrosis, is that right?
Uh-huh.
Would that have made his skin easier to tear through versus
Absolutely.
somebody who didn't?
Absolutely. I mean, speculation, when you have that kind of thing go on, you're going to have some inflammation. Inflammation literally means heat, okay? And when something's heated up, especially skin, it becomes more tender, more what's called friable, which means it bleeds easier. So yeah, definitely. And those nerve endings are going to be a little bit more on edge, I guess is the best way to put it. You're getting into theology now. I don't know. So you need to ask that to somebody else. I'm medical, okay? Not trying to dodge your question, but I don't know if you heard him. His question was, where did this happen? Kevin?
This will probably be speculation on your part, but
No, you're fine.
the Romans that beat him or scourged him, do you think they would have had some kind of knowledge in anatomy to know exactly how to hit him and how hard?
Oh, yeah. They were I think they were trained through experience. Okay, I mean, and again, they perfected this. They knew exactly. I mean, if I went to do something like this to somebody, I would have probably killed them in 5 minutes or quit after one hit, okay? Because they had the knowledge of exactly how to hit, exactly how to do tissue damage, exactly how far to go. They were very skilled in this from what I read about other crucifixions. Yeah, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to do it. Other questions? No, sorry I can't answer your question. I apologize. Next slide. Okay, it goes into it. Soldiers were very skilled without killing the victim. Typically, they would cut the victim loose. Remember, they're hanging like this. Okay? Even the baddest among us would hit the ground after this. We would be totally incapacitated. Victim would fall to the ground, typically lying in their own blood. I mean, they're bleeding this entire time. When they fall, they're falling straight down. And they're not falling on a nice concrete floor or a nice padded area. They're falling on dirt. Or whoever knows what else would be there, depending on where they were at, Kevin. Okay? So, dirt and blood and all the open wounds. Now, I mean, pretty graphic picture. Next slide. Okay? The soldiers at this point, if you remember, propped Jesus up. And I think they literally had to prop him up. They stuck a reed in his hand, as you'll remember, and they put a robe made, and I can't spell, apparently it's mad, but it's made. I'll blame Madison for that. She helped me with the slides. So anyway, of mohair, which was a harsh, prickly fabric made from camels. Why am I bringing that up? Because when they stuck that on him, on his raw back that was like a single wound, or on his legs or whatever, that stuff's going to stick to the blood. Blood's very sticky. That's what platelets do. So it's going to stick to this fabric, okay? blood and blood products adhere to it. When the robe was removed at whatever point it was, that's going to tear more flesh and it's going to restart any bleeding that was already occurring. Okay? So again, we're talking about blood loss that may have stopped and blood loss which has been reactivated. Okay? I can't imagine they gently peeled it off of him either. I just can't see that happening. But this was a very rough material. I'm sure it was uncomfortable when he's moving around. Next slide. Okay. When they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head. Next slide if we could. Now, these were not briars. Does anybody have any thorn trees in their yard? I had one at my old place, and those thorns were about that long. Okay, I dreaded trying to mow underneath it because I was invariably going to hit one of them and it was going to stick me, okay? I don't think this was a crown like we see visualized. I think it was more like a helmet. Okay, I think that they twisted it up just would make more sense in this situation, okay? Remember that the scalp is one of the most vascular areas. Anybody who doesn't believe that, come down and help me sew up a head laceration and you'll see exactly how much you're going to bleed while you're working on them. It's hard to get them to stop. It's hard to get it closed, okay? When they pressed it into his head, there's only about that much tissue between your scalp and the skull. So I would bet those things were going all the way to the bone, okay? If it's that vascular and these things are as big as I think they are, and the cuts that occur when they pressed it down on his head, more bleeding is occurring at this point, guys. We're talking about massive hemorrhaging overall, okay? And anybody that's been hit in the head knows there's a large amount of pain that happens when you have a head laceration, whatever it may be. Next slide if we could. Okay, after putting the crown of thorns on and robe on Jesus, they stood him up and mocked him. Okay, the soldiers started hitting him again. Okay, I suspect with the crown of thorns on his head, when they were hitting him, I hope that it injured the soldiers. I hope that they took off beating him with their fist again and it hurt some of them. Okay, I think that's why they probably started using the reed. Again, speculation. And this reed's not like what we see in ponds around here. This was a stiff thing, almost like a stick. I don't know if it was as thick as cane, but I know it was hard. It wasn't floppy. Okay, but I think that's why they started using it. I think they were hurting themselves trying to hurt him. That's my hope. Okay, much more pain, much more bleeding is occurring. These thorns are going to shift back and forth as they're being hit, tearing tissue, causing more bleeding to occur. Next slide. Okay, hypovolemic shock. You remember we talked about that when you lose enough blood volume that your body does not get adequate perfusion or blood to the areas that it needs. Okay, why do I think that? Well, we've got the hematohydrosis, however you want to pronounce it, beaten in the face at the first trial, scourged by the soldiers, crown of thorns. I mean, and the list goes on and on. Okay, he's lost a lot of blood. How much has he lost? I mean, I've read a lot of theories on that, and I'm not even going to speculate how much. I mean, this 28,490 drops or whatever it may be, all I know is that the human body typically contains about 10 pints of blood, okay, 12 depending on the size of the person. If he's lost less than 3 to 4 at this point in time, I'd be surprised, okay, maybe more. And that puts you on the verge of death. Guys, we're not even to the cross yet. Okay, we hadn't even started there yet. Okay, next slide. Path to Calvary. Okay, now this is where I get myself in trouble. The cross, I have this image of Jesus carrying the whole cross. That was not typically the Roman method. The Roman method was to take the cross beam, or the patibulum, I believe is how it's pronounced, okay, tied it across the shoulders with their arms. Okay, so they're carrying this beam across there that weighed somewhere between 75 and 125 pounds. Okay, distance from trial, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, 300 to 650 yards. Now you lose that much blood volume, I wouldn't be able to pick that thing up. If Jesus carried it, I don't know how he carried it 5 feet. Okay, I suspect he was in good condition. I suspect he could carry it with no problem otherwise. I don't know how far he carried it. I do know why he had to have help. Okay, I couldn't have done it. I don't think anybody in this room could have carried it 25 yards. Okay, but that's a speculation on that part. So 300 to 650 yard forced march, already being that down that low. Next slide if we could. The crucifixion itself. Okay, as we go, I've got a couple of slides past the crucifixion that have to do with the way to it, but I wanted to organize it where we're to the point where we've got him tied up to this patibulum. He's got to make this long walk, and that's where we're going to start. Okay, that to me is the start of the crucifixion, which is what Brother Miller wanted me to talk about tonight. So we're just now getting there. Next slide. Okay, Jesus would have continued to bleed. His shoulders would have been macerated. This piece of wood rubbing across them is going to cause more bleeding to occur. Okay? More than likely, he drifted in and out of consciousness. If not, he's in that state where vision is blurred, where you can't think straight, where your mouth is dry, where you ache all. I mean, it's just, there's a whole lot of things that go along with it. Probably fell repeatedly. Remember, he's being mocked, probably hit, kicked, dragged. I mean, they're not going to be nice about this. If they beat him that bad to start with, why would they start being nice now? Why would they say, oh, we're going to help you out with that? Next slide. The crowd was probably taunting, probably spitting. If they're going to crucify him, they don't care what they do to him if they're hollering that. I mean, they're not everybody, but I'm sure some were. Okay. Also, a few thoughts we won't cover. Think about the mental anguish that he's dealing with. Okay. Think about the fact that he's not slept in over 24 hours, most likely. He's been up all night. He's been on trial multiple times. We're at close to 9 o'clock in the morning, correct? And then we talked about 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay. Abandonment. What did all his apostles do? Scattered. Okay. He was truly alone in this world in many, many different ways, but he's by himself. And none of us like that. We all like to say, yeah, I need some time by myself. But when it gets down to it, after about an hour, we're like, well, I need somebody to talk to. Okay. Unfortunately, people around me can't get me to shut up, so they're probably like, get away from me. But anyway, next slide if we could. Okay, crucifixion facts. They typically lasted to 3 to 4 hours. They had very little bleeding associated with them. Okay, I don't think Jesus lost a lot more blood volume while he was on the cross. He lost some, there's no doubt. But I think it probably at that point in a healthy male, some of it should be slowing down to the point where it's not just like it was when they were scourging him and everything else. Bleeding and length of crucifixion depended on the amount of blood loss prior to and the weather events outside. It stands to reason if it's cooler, you're not going to dehydrate or have problems as quickly. If it is hotter outside, you're going to dry out a lot more quickly. And correct on that for people that work outside? Yeah, that happens. That's what it is. Next slide. The nails. You know, this isn't a 16-penny nail we're talking about, okay? Does anybody besides me know what a 16-penny nail is? Lynn, you know what it is? Yeah, you know. I'm glad you know. So it's a good wife you have there, Glenn. That's the way things are. These are quite large. They're 3/8 of an inch wide typically, okay, and 5 to 7 inches long. Guys, that's a railroad spike. If y'all have ever seen one of those, that's what they're driving through. Next slide. Always have the perception that Jesus has nail holes in his hand. That's not how this reads that it typically occurred. And if that happened, a person could not hang on the cross. Typically, they were nailed through the wrist. Okay? The wrist has got some rigidity in that area. It's going to hold a nail. You're not going to pull it through like you would if it was nailed into a hand. We know that Jesus didn't have any broken bones. Okay? They were very good at this. They would actually put this nail in the middle of the wrist. They would miss the two major arteries, being the radial and ulnar artery, which are highlighted, because if they hit those, it would be over a whole lot quicker. But they did know enough anatomy to put it through the median nerve. Okay, the median nerve is the nerve that people have problems with carpal tunnel syndrome. Okay, so not only did they drive it through, typically they severed that nerve. And y'all have heard about phantom pain in people that have lost limbs and things like this. I mean, you're talking about a searing pain that is just torturous. Okay, and it doesn't go away as soon as it's done. It just keeps on going. Okay, that pulsating electrical pain that you've had before. Okay, remember that the blood supply is still good to the hand, so it's still viable tissue. And when that nail, when they hung him on the cross, it was going to hang on the end of those bones, between that and the wrist bones. There's no way when he got that they were in the same spot every time. There had to be some flesh tearing when that occurred, but not major bleeding. Next slide if we could. Just another slide showing a different angle of how they went through and how they missed the major bones, hit the nerves, missed the major arteries. Next slide. Feet were the same way. Now, this is a bad slide. This is one I tried to reproduce. It wasn't very good. Typically, between the third and fourth, or the second and third, they would come down through on the foot in that area, in the region of the top of the foot. Again, so that area of the bone could catch and hold. You got to remember that area is not tearing up. That area's got pressure down on it, so they want the pressure this direction. Okay. There's the anatomy of the foot. There's not a lot in that area. You don't have a lot of major arteries in that area. You do have several nerves, but you have a lot of tendons, okay? And those tendons, even though they don't have very good blood supply, when they're cut, they hurt, okay? I can't think of an example where I've had anybody in the church that's had a tendon that's been cut, but that's painful when that happens, okay? And the pressure is being put so that when you push down on that foot, the pushing is this direction. You couldn't jerk it up and pull it loose, but you're putting all the pressure down. So they were experts, guys. They knew their anatomy. They knew what to do. Back to your Kevin question, they knew exactly where to put those nails, exactly how to hang them without killing them. Okay, next slide if we could. Respiratory effects. Now remember earlier we talked about hypovolemic shock and an increased respiratory rate. Hang on to that thought, okay? Hypovolemic shock increases respiratory rate, but the process of crucifixion was all about respiration, okay? It was all about affecting that. That was how they wanted people to die slowly. Next slide if we could. This is a bad slide, and y'all hang with me on this. Normal inspiration, when we take a breath in, is a negative pressure system. What that means is the intercostal muscles pull the chest wall out. Okay, this is active. We're actively pulling those chest wall muscles out. The diaphragm, which separates the abdomen and the chest, pulls down. It's the equivalent of grabbing hold of a balloon, if you could do that, and pulling it apart. The air comes rushing in. Okay, that's an active process. We're actively doing that. When we go to breathe out, the elasticity of these muscles and everything, when we get to that point, is a passive process. It shrinks down like squeezing the air out of that balloon, okay, except it does it on its own, okay? That's normal. Active in, passive out. In other words, it comes out on its own easily, okay? When you are hanging like this, your intercostal muscles do not work correctly, okay? You are having to use your diaphragm and pull some negative air in, so you have very shallow breathing. We know with hypovolemic shock that we have active breathing. Philip, I'm probably not going to finish. Can I keep going? Okay. Huh? It's up to you. Whatever you want me to do. All right, let's go then. All right. So anyway, when that happens, when you're go back to the other slide if you would. When you're hanging upside down, what they would have to do in order to catch a breath is they would have to push or pull up to allow those muscles to work correctly. Remember the state of his back at this point in time, okay? Remember the state of his flesh. Remember that his heart rate's up, his respiratory rate's up. He's got all this stuff going on. We'll go through the rest of it quickly, but it changes everything about how we breathe. So it's a panting. It's a labored breathing. It's directly opposite of everything our brain is telling us to do. Next slide if we could. You retain carbon dioxide, which makes you confused. Okay, if you've had anybody had COPD, they'll retain carbon dioxide and they'll talk out of their heads from time to time. Muscle cramps, contractures, increased respiratory rate. Fluid on the lungs probably occurred just because we're not getting enough through. Movement causes pain, increased respiratory rate. Next slide. Heart irregularities, congestive heart failure where the heart won't squeeze enough blood to move it through our system can occur. Fluid around the sac of the heart, okay? That's hard to describe, but there's a sac around the heart that fills with fluid. When it is, the heart can't squeeze correctly. Increased heart rate, heart attack. Anybody's had heart disease in here knows if they have heart pain, that's something very uncomfortable. Next slide if we could. And end organ failure like we talked about earlier. Kidneys, GI tract, muscular system. Eventually, central nervous system starts shutting down. Next slide if we could. All right, there are 10 different theories on why Jesus died. Maybe 11. I don't know which one it was. I think it was a combination of several things. I lean more toward what's called exhaustive asphyxia. Basically, he couldn't breathe anymore. His muscles, he was so depleted of fluid from hypovolemic shock that he couldn't breathe. Okay, and that's important. Hang on to that. Other things that can occur, those things, dehydration, heart failure, whatever it may be. Everybody has their theories on that. Nobody can prove anything in my book. Next slide if we could. My opinion is Jesus gave up his life freely. We know that. Why do I think that? If you cannot breathe, you cannot talk. Okay? Kind of like I always say when I'm running, people that talk while they're running, they're not running hard enough. Right, Glenn? They're not running hard enough. If they can talk while they're running, they're not running hard enough. You can't breathe. Okay? When you're hanging on the cross like that, you can't breathe. If you push up to get a good breath in, it's still not a good breath. Okay? So, and when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathes his last breath. How in the world did he holler? If he hadn't given up his life freely, how in the world did he talk or holler loudly, scream out? He would be lucky if he could go, oh, okay? My thought on it. That's why I think that he gave up his life. That's why all these diagnoses to me don't really mean anything. I think there was a lot going on in his body. But again, I think he gave it up freely for that very reason. Arguments on that I'll take. Next slide if we could. When you read this verse, after hearing what you've heard, and think about it, it puts it in a whole different perspective. God knew exactly what was going to happen to Jesus. I can't imagine what this was like. I don't even want to know, okay? I know the anatomy, I know what happens, and I know what was going on. I still can't imagine what happened. It just pains me to think about that any human, no matter what the situation is, would go through something like that for me. And then I turn around and act the way I do the things I do, say the things I say, feel about people the way I feel, okay? I mean, it's really, when I do this talk, it always brings me back and say, why do you do these things when this happened for me? If you don't know Jesus Christ, I hope that you find a way and learn. I really do, because what he did is beyond anything I can imagine. I don't know if I could go through this for my kids or my wife. I think I could. I don't know. I mean, I definitely would. As opposed to them, I'd definitely do it before I let something happen to them. But I can't imagine what he went through. Sorry, guys. Got on my soapbox there. Questions? Next slide. Questions from anybody? Philip, sir, I took too long. No, I'm done. Philip made me promise 45 minutes, and I got it in 49 minutes. Is that right? Thank you, guys.
I'm glad that Jeff Mayfield's my doctor. I'm glad that he is, because he knows the Lord, first of all. He's a very intelligent man, and I appreciate him. Appreciate that talk. I remembered some of it from the last time. I think he pulled a lot out of that. If y'all can twist his arm wherever he went, twist his arm, and we can make him do more, because I know he's got more. So y'all can twist his arm. I'm gonna get right to it, because we want to save time for our choir. But I do want to say this: since I am now a Wednesday night crucifixion, or a Wednesday crucifixion, so Christ is in the grave. He's in the grave. So kind of makes me emotional there for a moment. He's in the grave. He'll be in the grave tomorrow. He'll be in the grave on Friday. He'll be in the grave on Saturday. And then about midnight on Saturday, 1 o'clock Sunday morning, he'll be up from the grave he arose. So the next few days, give thoughts on your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Give some time thinking about our Lord's crucifixion, and be ready to worship him on Easter Sunday morning. Announcements that this coming Saturday, we do have our Easter egg hunt from 2 to 4 p.m., rain or shine. We'll figure out what we have to do if it's raining. If you are an Easter egg hider, you need to be here at noon. If you are working, you need to be here at 1. If you have any questions, ask Ryan Tucker. So take notice of that. There are flyers out there that you can use, take a picture of, share it on your, send a bunch of text messages to all your people, and invite people to come. We want it to make it a great event for our community. We also want to make an opportunity to reach people for our church. We hope that we get a chance to invite people to our sunrise service. Hope we have a big, huge crowd on Sunday morning. And then Easter sunrise service, 6:30. It'll be out here in the parking lot. Bring your own chair, and we'll be set up under the portico. And it won't be a long service, but it will be a very important service. And we will be singing some songs. I will be reading a narrative of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So it's always a special time. So that's this coming Sunday, 6:30. We have Sunday school, 9:45. Worship service at 10:45. And then a couple of more for the following week. We have Ladies Bible Study on Tuesday. Thursday of the following week, we have our Senior Game Day on the 21st. Any other announcements? Kevin.
The men's Bible study is going to begin on, I'm shooting for June 6th.
June
6th.
June 6th.
We're going to be digging into the Master Life series, and the first book is The Disciples' Cross.
Okay.
So if any man is interested in doing that, there's a sign-up sheet on the bulletin board. We'd love to have you.
All right, Brother Kevin, thank you. Any other announcements?
On Monday, we will be moving all the furniture from the adult wing probably to the bus barn.
Okay.
We don't have our permit from the city yet, so got a note on when we can start our demolition. I hope to have that on Tuesday, but we'll see when it comes.
Okay, so what time do we start on Monday? You have time?
I'll be here early.
Okay.
So, as people can come, you know, I'm sure we can.
Okay, so
Maybe done before you get here, but if you get lucky. If we do.
Monday morning, 8 o'clock. Monday morning, 8 o'clock, we'll get started. So come. Any other announcements? Well, I say goodnight to our online audience. Thank you for being here with us. If you have a prayer concern, please send it our way. And with saying goodbye to them.